You always said you'd be there, James whispered, his voice cracking as he stood on my doorstep, rain-soaked and desperate. I took a moment to study him. The tailored suit that had once fit him perfectly now hung loose on his frame. His eyes, once bright with ambition, were sunken and rimmed with sleepless nights. I recognized the watch on his wrist, a Rolex I'd given him for his 30th birthday, back when I was working 2 jobs just to make rent. "And you said you didn't need me anymore," I replied, my voice steady as I leaned against the doorframe of my modest but immaculate home in Glastonbury, Connecticut. 6 weeks earlier, I was in the middle of my morning routine when my phone lit up with a news alert. I nearly dropped my coffee mug when I saw the headline, "Tech mogul James Bennett under federal investigation for fraud." I stared at his picture, the cocky smile, the perfect hair, the custom suit that cost more than my car. It had been 7 years since we'd spoken. 7 years since he'd looked me in the eye at the restaurant where he'd taken me to talk and said those words that still echoed in my head. "I've outgrown this, Ellie. I've outgrown us. Where I'm going, you just wouldn't fit." I'd sat there, stunned, as he explained how his new investors, his new colleagues, his new life required someone different. Someone who hadn't known him when he was just James from Midland Park, with big dreams and empty pockets. Someone who matched his newfound status. The humiliation had burned worse than the pain. I'd supported him through everything. The failed startups, the maxed out credit cards, the nights he'd question if he had what it took. I'd believed in him when no one else would. I'd been the one who convinced my uncle to invest the initial seed money that launched QuantumSphere, the tech security company that ultimately made James his millions. And he discarded me like an old sweater that no longer fit his image. I put my phone down and got ready for work. I was a financial forensic analyst now, having returned to school after our breakup. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd reinvented myself by learning to follow money trails and uncover financial deception, skills I might have used to help James, had he kept me around. At the office, James's scandal was all anyone could talk about. "Did you see that Bennett guy is going down?" my colleague Marco asked as I settled at my desk. "They're saying he's been cooking the books for years, hiding losses, inflating user numbers." I nodded noncommittally. Apparently, the SEC's got emails, transactions, they've been building a case for months. Dude's finished. I shouldn't have cared. I told myself I didn't. But that night, I pulled up every article I could find about James and QuantumSphere. The company had been in decline for 2 years, losing clients after a major security breach they'd tried to cover up. James had been offloading his own stock while publicly reassuring investors. Classic securities fraud. I almost closed my laptop when a name caught my eye. Bradford Whitley, QuantumSphere's CFO. I knew that name. Brad had been a friend of James's back when we were together, a finance guy with flexible ethics who'd always rubbed me the wrong way. I'd warned James about him, but he'd laughed it off. "Brad knows how to work the system, L. That's why I need him." I stared at Brad's corporate headshot, remembering the night I'd overheard him suggesting ways to creatively account for some early expenses. I'd confronted James later, and he'd dismissed my concerns. "That's just how business works. You wouldn't understand." My phone buzzed with a text from my Uncle Richard. "You seeing this Bennett news? Glad I got my investment out years ago." Guy always seemed shady to me. That wasn't entirely true. Uncle Richard had liked James initially, but soured on him after our breakup. He'd pulled his investment from QuantumSphere shortly after, on my quiet recommendation. "Yes, seeing it all," I texted back. Not surprised. I went to bed that night thinking I'd put James behind me years ago. But the knot in my stomach suggested otherwise. The next morning, I received an email that made my heart skip a beat. The sender, Carson Mills, a federal prosecutor I'd worked with on several cases in my capacity as a financial analyst. "Need your expertise on a sensitive case. Available for a meeting today." 3 hours later, I was sitting in Carson's office, trying to maintain my professional composure as he slid a folder across his desk. "QuantumSphere," he said. "Familiar with it?" I hesitated just long enough. Carson was perceptive. It's why he was good at his job. "You know the founder," he stated rather than asked. "Knew," I corrected. "A lifetime ago." Carson nodded, not pressing further. We've got him on securities fraud. The evidence is solid. But we think there's more: money laundering, possibly tax evasion. The financial structures are complex. That's where you come in. Why me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Carson leaned back in his chair. Because you're the best at what you do. And because, frankly, your history with Bennett might give you insights others wouldn't have. I should have recused myself. That would have been the professional thing to do. But something stirred inside me. Not revenge, exactly, but a desire for closure. Justice. I'll need complete access to all financial records, I said. Carson smiled. Already arranged. For the next 3 weeks, I immersed myself in James's financial world. I tracked money across shell companies and offshore accounts. I identified patterns in transactions that others had missed. I found connections to investment vehicles that existed only to hide losses and inflate gains. I worked late into the night, fueled by a determination I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't personal, I told myself. It was just the job. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. One evening, while digging through a particularly convoluted set of transactions, I found something that made my blood run cold. A series of payments from Quantum Sphere to a company called Meridian Consulting. The company was registered to Brad Whitley's wife. The payments had begun 7 years ago, right around the time James had ended things with me. I pulled up the dates. The first payment was made 3 days after our breakup. A memory surfaced. James on his phone during one of our last dinners together, tense and distracted. When I'd asked what was wrong, he'd mentioned something about potential compliance issues that Brad was helping him handle. I dug deeper. Meridian Consulting had received regular payments for strategic services, but there was no evidence that the company provided any actual services. It was a classic front for embezzlement. I took my findings to Carson the next morning. This goes beyond securities fraud, I explained, laying out the evidence. They've been siphoning company funds for personal use for years. And there's a pattern of suspicious transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Carson whistled low. This is excellent work, Ellie. With this, we can bring a much stronger case. I should have felt satisfied. My work would help bring James to justice. But something kept nagging at me, a detail I couldn't quite place. That night, I reviewed my old emails on a whim. James and I had shared an online calendar during our time together, and I never deleted the account. It was still there, untouched for 7 years. I scrolled back, looking at the appointments, the dinner reservations, the weekend trips we'd planned. And then I saw it. A meeting James had scheduled with Brad at a hotel bar in Hoboken, the night before he'd broken up with me. The subject line: exit strategy. My hands trembled as the pieces fell into place. The compliance issues. The first payment to Meridian 3 days after our breakup. The exit strategy meeting. James hadn't just outgrown me. He'd been planning to engage in fraud, and he knew I would have seen through it. I was the liability he needed to cut loose before launching his scheme. I'd been discarded not because I wasn't good enough, but because I was too honest. I forwarded the calendar entry to Carson with a brief note. You might find this relevant. Suggests premeditation. His response came minutes later. This changes things. We're moving up the timeline. Arrests likely within 48 hours. The news broke on a Tuesday. James Bennett and Bradford Whitley were arrested on multiple charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Quantum Sphere's stock plummeted. Investors filed lawsuits. The tech world buzzed with the spectacular fall of a once rising star. I watched it unfold from a distance, feeling strangely hollow. The justice I'd helped deliver didn't bring the satisfaction I'd expected. 3 days after the arrests, I received a call from an unknown number. Is this Eleanor Reeves? A woman's voice asked. Yes. This is Margaret Foster, James Bennett's attorney.
She paused.
He's asked to speak with you. I nearly declined, but curiosity got the better of me.
Why?
He says you possess information that could help contextualize certain aspects of the case. I've already provided all relevant information to the prosecution. There was a pause on the line. Ms. Reeves, I'll be direct. Mr. Bennett is facing serious charges. Anything that might mitigate his situation would be valuable. He believes your history together might offer some perspective. I almost laughed. Our history together is precisely why I doubt I can help him. He's mentioned something about explaining circumstances you may not be aware of, about why certain decisions were made 7 years ago. My heart thumped against my ribs.
Fine.
One conversation. At the Federal Building, with Carson Mills present. That can be arranged. 2 days later, I sat across from James in a sterile meeting room. He'd traded his designer suits for prison blues. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by dark circles under his eyes and a defeated slump to his shoulders.
Carson sat beside me.
Margaret Foster beside James. "Thank you for coming, Ellie," James said, his voice smaller than I remembered. "It's Eleanor now. And I'm here out of professional courtesy, not personal consideration." He nodded, accepting the correction. "I understand. There are things you should know. About why I ended things the way I did." "I'm aware of why," I said coldly. "You were planning to commit fraud and knew I'd be a problem." James flinched. "It wasn't that simple." "Enlighten me then." He leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "Brad had information about some irregular accounting in our early days. Things my uncle, our first investor, had implemented before he brought in your uncle." I stayed silent, waiting. He threatened to expose it if I didn't follow his lead on the newer methods. Said it would tank the company before it really got started. James swallowed hard. "I was trying to protect everyone's investment, your uncle's included. By dumping me, Brad made it clear that you were too sharp. Said you asked too many questions. He said if we stayed together, you'd eventually see what was happening and would either become complicit or expose everything." James looked down. "I thought I was protecting you too, keeping you clean." Carson shifted beside me. "This is all very interesting, Mr. Bennett, but it doesn't change the charges against you." "I know that," James said quickly. "I'm not asking for leniency. I wanted Eleanor, to know the truth." I studied him, searching for the manipulation, the angle. But all I saw was the broken shell of the man I'd once loved. "Was there ever a moment," I asked quietly, "when you considered coming to me instead of cutting me out? When you thought about finding another way?" James's eyes met mine, and for a second, I saw a flash of the person I used to know. Every day for the first year. And then it got easier to justify, to forget. I nodded, standing up. "Thank you for the clarification. It doesn't change anything, but I appreciate the truth." As I turned to leave, James called after me. "I lost everything that mattered when I lost you, Elle. Everything after that was just stuff." I paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "Goodbye, James." Life moved on. James accepted a plea deal that would keep him in prison for at least 5 years. Bradford Whitley, facing more severe charges, was headed for trial. Quantum Sphere was sold off in pieces. The scandal faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer, fresher outrage. I threw myself into my work, gaining a reputation for catching financial discrepancies others missed. Carson referred more cases my way. I bought a small house in Glastonbury with a garden I tended on weekends. I dated occasionally, but never let anyone get too close. 4 months after James's sentencing, I received a letter from him. I almost threw it away unopened, but something stopped me. Inside was a single page. "Eleanor, I've had a lot of time to think about the choices I made. There's no excuse for what I did. To you, to the company, to everyone who trusted me. But I want you to know that losing you was the beginning of my downfall, not because you were holding me up, but because you were holding me accountable. Without your moral compass, I lost mine. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just thought you deserved to know that I understand now what I threw away. James." I folded the letter and put it in my desk drawer, not quite ready to discard it, not quite sure why I was keeping it. 2 weeks later, Margaret Foster called again. "James's mother has been diagnosed with late-stage cancer," she explained. "He's requested a compassionate visit. It's been approved for this weekend, heavily supervised. She's at Hartford Hospital." "Why are you telling me this?" There was a pause. He asked me to. Said you'd know his mother, that you were close once. I had been close with Diane Bennett. She'd been like a mother to me during the years James and I were together. When he'd ended things, I'd lost her too. I'm sorry to hear about Diane, I said. But I don't see how it involves me. It doesn't necessarily. I'm just passing along the information. After we hung up, I sat on my porch, watching the rain. I thought about Diane, who had always been kind to me, who had called me, crying, after James broke up with me, swearing she didn't understand what had gotten into her son. I'd avoided her calls eventually, too painful a reminder of what I'd lost. Saturday morning found me at Hartford Hospital, flowers in hand, waiting in the corridor outside Diane's room. The guard stationed outside gave me curious looks, but didn't stop me when I gave my name. I heard James's voice through the partially open door, softer than I remembered, comforting his mother. I almost turned to leave when the door opened fully, and he stood there, frozen in surprise. Ellie, I heard about Diane, I said simply. I wanted to see her. He nodded, stepping aside to let me in. Diane was propped up in bed, thin and pale but with the same warm eyes I remembered. Eleanor, she breathed, reaching out a frail hand. Oh, honey. I took her hand, feeling tears prick at my eyes. I'll give you two some time, James said, nodding to the guards before stepping into the hallway. I spent an hour with Diane, listening to her talk about her treatments, her hopes, her fears. She didn't mention the scandal or James's crimes, and neither did I. When she began to tire, I kissed her cheek and promised to visit again. James was waiting in the corridor, guards standing a respectful distance away. Thank you for coming, he said. It means a lot to her. I nodded. She means a lot to me. He looked older than his 39 years, the burden of his choices etched into his face. How have you been, Elle? Good, I said and meant it. I found my path. I heard you were the one who uncovered most of the evidence against me, he said, a sad smile playing at his lips. Can't say I'm surprised. You always were the smartest person I knew. Not smart enough to see what was happening back then. You saw exactly what was happening. That's why I had to end it. You were the one variable Brad couldn't control. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past between us. I should go, I said finally. James nodded. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for the crimes, but for how I hurt you. You deserved better. Yes, I agreed. I did. As I turned to leave, he called after me. Ellie, are you happy?
Now.
I considered the question. Was I happy? I had a career I excelled at, a home I loved, friends who cared about me. I had peace. I'm content, I answered honestly. I built a good life for myself. I'm glad, he said, and I believed him. I visited Diane several more times over the following months. Sometimes James was there under supervision, sometimes not. We developed a careful, distant civility. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a recognition of the role we'd once played in each other's lives. Diane passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months after her diagnosis. I attended the funeral, standing at the back of the small chapel. James was allowed to attend in handcuffs, flanked by guards. Our eyes met across the room, and I gave him a small nod of condolence. After the service, as he was being led back to the transport van, he asked the guards for a moment to speak with me. Thank you for being there for her, he said. It meant everything. She was important to me too. He swallowed hard. I have a favor to ask. My house in Greenwich, it's being sold as part of the asset liquidation. There's a box in my office hidden in the wall behind the bookcase. It has your name on it. Things I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I hesitated. I don't know if I want those memories, James. It's not just mementos, he said quickly. It's evidence. Evidence of what? That I never completely gave up on you. On us. He glanced at the guards, who were becoming impatient. Just if you can. Please. The next day, I called Carson Mills and explained the situation. He arranged for me to accompany a federal agent to James's soon-to-be-seized estate in Greenwich. The house was exactly as I'd imagined it, vast, luxurious, and cold. the kind of place designed to impress rather than comfort. I followed James's instructions to his office, where the agent helped me locate the hidden compartment. Inside was a wooden box with my name carved into the lid. I opened it back at my hotel room. Inside were photographs of U.S., ticket stubs from concerts we'd attended, the first business plan James had ever written, with my notes in the margins. Beneath these mementos was a sealed envelope marked for Ellie, if I ever find the courage. Inside were bank statements for an account I'd never seen before in both our names. The initial deposit had been made the day after our breakup, a substantial sum. Regular deposits had followed over the years, the final one just a month before his arrest. A note was paper-clipped to the statements. I told myself this was your share of what we built together. The truth is, it was my way of keeping a connection to you, of telling myself that someday I might find a way back. The money is clean from my legitimate earnings before things went wrong. I hope someday it can help you build the life you deserve, the one I ruined. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, stunned. The account held over $3 million. My first instinct was to call Carson, to turn it all over as evidence.
But something stopped me.
I pulled out my phone and called Margaret Foster instead. The account James set up for me, I said when she answered. Did he declare it during asset disclosure? There was a brief pause. Yes, he did. It was listed as a trust account, set aside before any illegal activity began. The funds were verified as legitimate. The prosecution agreed not to seize it. So it's legal for me to access it? Completely. In fact, the paperwork to transfer full control to you has already been filed. I was planning to contact you next week. I ended the call and stared at the statements, trying to process what this meant. The money wouldn't bring back the years I'd lost, the pain I'd endured. But it represented something more complicated than restitution. It was proof that some part of James had never been able to let go completely, had recognized the magnitude of his betrayal. 5 months later, the doorbell rang at my Glastonbury home on a rainy evening. I opened it to find James standing there, soaked and defeated-looking. You always said you'd be there, he whispered, his voice cracking. I studied him, taking in how far he'd fallen. The man who had once had everything now had nothing. No company, no fortune, no reputation. And you said you didn't need me anymore. I replied, my voice steady. He flinched at my words.
I was wrong, Elle.
So wrong. About everything. How are you even here right now? I asked, not inviting him in. Aren't you supposed to be in prison? Released early, he said. Good behavior, plus the cooperation I provided that helped them nail Brad and some of the bigger players. I just got out yesterday. And I'm your first stop?
Why?
Because I have nowhere else to go, he admitted. Everyone else has written me off. My so-called friends, my colleagues, they all disappeared the moment the scandal hit. I felt a flicker of satisfaction, followed quickly by pity. That doesn't make me your backup plan, James. I know that. I know you owe me nothing. He ran a hand through his wet hair. I thought about you every day in there. About how different things could have been if I'd trusted you instead of pushing you away. We'll never know, I said softly. The money, he said suddenly. Did you find it? The account. I nodded. I did. And I donated most of it to establish a scholarship fund for students studying financial ethics. It seemed fitting. A small smile tugged at his lips. Of course you did. That's who you've always been. The rain was falling harder now, and despite everything, I couldn't leave him standing there. You should come in. Just until the storm passes. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. I stepped aside to let him enter, then led him to the kitchen. I poured 2 glasses of wine and sat across from him at my small table. What will you do now?
I asked.
He shrugged. Start over. Somewhere small, somewhere I can be anonymous. Try to rebuild something honest this time. I nodded, sipping my wine. I kept some of the money, I admitted. Enough to start a small consulting firm. I help companies identify financial vulnerabilities before they become problems. Using what you learned from taking me down, he said, no bitterness in his voice. Using what I learned from everything, I corrected. We sat in silence for a while, the rain pattering against the windows. There was a time when I'd imagined a dramatic confrontation between us. Tears, accusations, me finally telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me. But sitting here now, I realized I didn't need that anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by something quieter, a certainty in who I was and what I was worth. Do you think, James began hesitantly, that we could ever?
No, y interrupte gently.
That chapter's closed, James. He nodded, accepting this truth. I understand. When the rain finally stopped, I walked him to the door. There's a decent motel about 2 miles down the road. They take cash, no questions asked. Thank you, Elle. For everything. For tonight, for helping my mom, for not hating me as much as you could. I don't hate you at all, I said, surprised to find it was true. But I don't need you either. Not anymore. As he stepped onto the porch, he turned back. You built a good life here. I did. I agreed. It's mine, and no one can take it away from me. I watched him walk away, shoulders hunched against the evening chill. Then I closed the door, poured myself another glass of wine, and sat on my porch swing, listening to the dripping of the trees after the rain. Tomorrow, I'd meet with a potential client for my new consulting firm. The day after, I'd have dinner with friends. Next weekend, I'd plant the new rose bushes I'd bought for the garden. My life would go on, strong, steady, and completely my own.